recommended. Oh. I'll give Professor Soltes the floor, and the idea is that he will talk for about 25-30 minutes. In the meantime, if you have any questions, do ask them. There's a chat function, and we will collect all these questions, and we want to make sure that, of course, knowing that those in this webinar are central figures within the world of within the Dutch world of compliance and integrity, we do want to make room for your questions. So please do not hesitate to send them in after his talk. Do raise your hand, and we'll make sure that Professor Soltes answers all of them before 5:15. Sorry. Enough said from my side. Professor Soltes, Eugene, very happy to give you the floor.
Oh, well, thank you, Jonathan. Thanks so much for the invitation to join today. It's really a privilege. I only wish I, between my teaching, I could have made a short, but I guess not so short trip across the Atlantic to join you. I thought what I might do, because, you know, when I'm excited to actually have more of a discussion, but I thought I would take my few minutes at the beginning to really describe a little bit about the journey that has led me to now thinking about how to use data within organizations. But starting with the book that Jonathan actually mentioned originally, and how this evolution, because I'll say by background, I'm what you might describe as a quant, so someone that normally is looking at data and regressions. But my own interest and focus in this area actually began, I'll say, quite unexpectedly. I actually was like any good graduate student, if I go back 14 years ago, up late one night working on my dissertation, and this all started when I was literally flipping through the TV channels, and I came across a show on MSNBC TV network here called Lockup. It's a fascinating cross between a reality TV show and a documentary, in which they're interviewing people that have generally committed a variety of violent offenses, murder, assault, other nasty things, and the people are describing the circumstances that led them to prison. And by and large, they're describing things like gangs and drugs and other circumstances. And I'm watching this show, and this is very much while Enron was still in the news. Bernie Madoff had recently been arrested. And I was wondering, if I had a half an hour, like the producers on the show did with some of these individuals, what would they say? How would they explain the circumstances that led them there? And so that night, this is pure personal curiosity. This is certainly not an academic research project or really any project for that matter. I wrote a number of prominent executives, people from Enron, some people from Computer Associates, whose cases I had been following. I think, like many people, they were in the news. And I just, in the United States, actually, when you go to federal prison, it's oddly easy to look up people's addresses to write them. And I sent them the first 10 questions that came to the top of my mind, without really, again, literally that night. A couple months later, I started to receive some responses. So the first person to actually respond was Dennis Kozlowski, who was the former CEO of Tyco, one of the most well-respected and celebrated CEOs, also one of the most highly paid in the country for his achievement and growth at Tyco, but also would ultimately be convicted of embezzling large sums of money from Tyco in the course of his employment. And he described, I have, more time on my hands now. If you come visit me, we could spend some time speaking. And a number of people responded similarly. And so what I started doing, and again, this is really just personal curiosity. Like, if you had, first an hour or a couple hours to talk with formerly an incredibly well-respected, impressive executive who's now facing a very different set of circumstances, I think all of us maybe have some degree of curiosity, and I was simply, satisfying mine. But what was interesting is what began as a series of conversations of an hour here or an hour there, began as a couple hours, then a couple weeks, and then a couple months, and ultimately returned to 7 years of work, a couple thousand hours of interviews with approximately 50 of the most prominent individuals who engaged in white-collar crimes. Ultimately, what the book effectively argues and describes is a set of circumstances in which smart and thoughtful people, in some instances, effectively engage in this misconduct and these really serious ramifications in what I would almost describe as what I describe as almost a mindlessness of not broadly seeing and appreciating the extraordinary ramifications associated with their actions. And it's really interesting because in most, unlike street crime, misconduct in the corporate boardroom doesn't have that same physical and psychological intimacy that hitting someone would, even though it obviously has an extraordinarily great set of negative ramifications. And so I spent a lot of time exploring that. So I went from a quant to almost a psychologist and someone studying organizational behavior in the course of the book. I mean, the thought experiment that I think about or oftentimes, ask, and I've asked myself this, is, we all think that knowing the difference between right and wrong is sufficient to stop us from going forward. But I think we could all find ways we can violate that. And if we were all together in a room, I would ask, how many of you drive? And I suspect, most all of us would raise our hand. So I'll play this with myself. And do you speed? And even though we're in a room of people who are attorneys, compliance professionals, academics, I mean, that are literally studying this area, we all find ways that even though we know something is wrong, we actually go forward with it. And, I've thought about this as someone that, going in the United States, we use miles per hour, so 65 and the 55. And, while I'm speeding, I'm not really thinking about speeding. It doesn't seem like it's that egregious or harmful. I actually had conversations with my wife in the car that it's actually the one person that's going slow that people have to drive around that actually is the more dangerous person. If you're just keeping up with the traffic, again, everyone is doing it. That's safer. But those are a host of rationalizations as why it's okay to break the rules. What we really need is we need to feel something is harmful. And if we feel something is harmful, we don't even consider it as part of our choice set. And this is why, I live in Cambridge, right outside of Harvard Square. I have a reasonably good set of socialized neighbors. I'm not particularly worried if the city of Cambridge was to drop this afternoon the prohibition against, murder on our street. You can go kind of wild. Anyone can do whatever they want on the street that lives on the street. I still wouldn't be particularly worried about going out on my porch and like someone chasing me down the street with a hatchet. Why? Reasonably well socialized people don't take out their grievances against one another in that manner. It's not the law that's constraining behavior. Rather it's people's kind of internal gut sense that you don't actually engage in that kind of harm to another person. But what's challenging is in the corporate context, or I would say in the boardroom context, we don't necessarily have that same feeling of harmfulness. And as much as we, certain serious conduct, for example, if we think of, bribes, something like bribes are bad. I think everyone here has this strong sense that like bribery is bad and actually has very serious ramifications, civilly and criminally, different jurisdictions around the world. That's still quite recent. I mean, prior to the 1970s, in 1977, it was legal in the United States. Prior to the late 90s, it was legal and tax deductible in a number of places within Europe. So the idea, it's a pretty recent sense of like, this is actually harmful. Or if we take something very recent, sanctions, something that if we talk about Iranian sanctions here in the United States, or the more recent Russia sanctions, and this is an area where, and I do this in my exec ed classes where we have people from all over the world, there's varying degrees of sense about whether those sanctions actually make sense, are actually fair, or are actually good or bad. And so we don't have that same hard-worded feeling of harmfulness as we would with a street crime. So I think this really creates a challenge for compliance leaders and professionals, is that much of the conduct that we need to constrain and we need to try to manage are things that are still, we have these Stone Age minds, but we're confronting these new types of issues and new types of conduct that will have new types of consequences. Consequences. And how do we constrain that behavior? And I think this is what makes compliance such an exciting area. And so much of my work over the last 7 years is really then focused on, okay, given what people's intuitions are, given our limitations as human beings, we have like Stone Age minds and these really complex modern settings in which people can very quickly through an email cause these extraordinary ramifications for people that are thousands of miles away. How do we seek to adjust to this new world? And I think this is what makes it so exciting, because in some ways we can think of as compliance as a field of just law. It's people that need to complete certain requirements. So we have a code of conduct, and the code of conduct says you need to do X, Y, or Z. People attest that they will do X, Y, and Z. But what do we know? And I think everyone realizes here that you can have people sign documents that say, I've read and reviewed the code of conduct. But if you literally ask people, like we've done a week later, and most code of conduct attestations actually say, I will follow it, and I will report any violations that I see. If you literally ask people a week later, did you report any violations that you've seen over the past year? You generally find, and this is from large corporation data, generally between 30 and 50% of people say yes. So you have a legal contract, but then we have all these psychological and organizational issues that can potentially undermine that. And I think this is what where a lot of, I think, both the interest in innovation and a lot of the opportunities come from in compliance is how do we utilize the data and other, I'll say, information that we can collect to better understand where those opportunities and gaps are within organizations. Another way of framing this is, every executive and every CEO that comes to Harvard Business School, one of the first things they do, and I love that this is always a consistent focus at the beginning of any talk, is to talk about an organization's culture. And here's our organizational culture, and here's what distinguishes it from other industries and actually our competitors within our industry. But they describe one homogeneous culture of, this is our firm's culture. But I think what we all can appreciate is that within any organization, even one of modest size, what you really have is an amalgamation of hundreds of subcultures, or if not thousands of subcultures. These are by location, by role, by function, a whole host of attributes. And I think the opportunity for compliance is, rather than saying, we have one culture, we're going to have one code of conduct, we will have one system to address and actually nudge people to behave in certain ways, to really both assess, understand, and then develop different, or we could say different flavors of that compliance program and integrity program to adjust for those different cultures, some of which may need more attention and different kinds of attention than others. And so much of the data-focused work that I'm currently doing is focused on, first, how do we take a company and divide up into many different subcultures? And then how do we identify which of these subcultures pose the greatest risk for the organization? So are most likely to have issues that would actually lead to the firm or managers themselves within that organization facing potential challenges in the future. And maybe I'll name one variable and then use this to spur some conversation. But so we look at a lot of different variables about kind of, we could say, lead lag. What are some of the variables that predict? And so this is really running predictive models, predict where there would be future violations. And one of the variables that I have found most interesting, and I will say we spend a lot of time focusing and trying to understand, is what I would describe as unsubstantiated HR violations being a leading indicator, a predictor of where there will be legal compliance violations down the road. So that means you see a host of unsubstantiated HR issues in a group, and then what we will expect to find 9 to 12 months later is a host of legal compliance violations. Now, what's our underlying hypothesis, or why are we seeing this in the data? Well, what we are saying, I'll say the hypothesis is that individuals will raise issues about their manager making them uncomfortable. So someone raising that my manager has said or does something in a way that is described as harassment. But I think, as we all know, the bar for legal harassment is actually quite high. And there's a lot of awful things managers can do to make people feel uncomfortable and not that are not appropriate, but still don't hit that bar of legal harassment and would be difficult to substantiate. And so what you have is sometimes these, what I describe as high performance managers who make people feel really uncomfortable in their environment. A host of people will actually call the hotline or report these concerns. The company does everything right, looks into it, doesn't find sufficient evidence to substantiate it. And so the company is doing everything correct from its legal and compliance processes. And so no action is taken. And then what happens? Well, for the person that reported that alleged violation, they don't look at what the legal bar for harassment is. They're not thinking about all those, I'll say, the technical legal compliance parts. They look at it as someone made them feel uncomfortable. The company looked into it and didn't do anything about it. So the company doesn't respect them. And as a result, what happens? This builds up within groups. And then what we see is those individuals stop respecting the company. And so what we see is things like embezzlement, sabotage of machinery, people just showing up late and doing their work within those subgroups in a more sloppy or inefficient manner. We've actually even connected this at a manufacturing company to actually lower productivity on the line. And so what this has actually become so interesting is we can say on one hand, there's legal compliance, which is actually looking for violation, doing those investigations. And when those investigations are substantiated, taking appropriate disciplinary action. But it actually is a much broader, more complicated, and I'll say exciting area because of the psychology of it. And that there are areas like the example I've just illustrated in which you might have people engaging in conduct that it's not actually a legal or compliance violation, but it's not allowing people to do their best work. And it actually, because of those externalities that's created, actually then creates other issues down the road. And so what role does integrity, ethics, and compliance play in terms of the broader culture and managing, I would say, this type of undesirable conduct that may not be a legal compliance violation to ultimately, which is what we're all trying to do, spur organizational success and people's well-being in the workplace. And so ultimately, it's the area that really inspires me. I find very exciting about compliance, but also I think it's what makes it so challenging is we have a lot of different things intersecting all in one place. And one of, I think, our great opportunities is to, I think, change that perception of compliance and integrity to help people better appreciate that it's this amalgamation of really interesting legal, integrity, compliance, and oftentimes some data in the background that we're trying to address. So maybe with those couple, and I suspect I've said at least a couple things in there that are mildly provocative, or at least will spur some ideas or questions. I can open up or go back to you with Jonathan, which if you have any questions or things you wanted to raise, and we could start discussing.
Sure. And of course, an invitation to all the participants to ask their questions and to raise their hands. But let me start off. In your book, one of the things that you mention is that talking about these subcultures is that people get kind of socialized within the subculture, and then the norms of the subculture become, let's say, more important to them than, well, the let's say the legal norms. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on that, and also, of course, this is the question that was like ringing in the back of my head when I was reading your book. What can corporations do about these subcultures, and is it like a thousand needle approach where it's so many variables and you have to change one, and maybe after needle 600 you're improving your company, or are there is there some low-hanging fruit that you can tackle first?
Great questions, and I think even your phrasing of it shows, I think, some of the challenge. I mean, so the first, and I kind of alluded to this, is that this artificial sense of like one culture, or like this homogeneating culture. What I don't think anyone actually believes that. Even when a CEO is literally describing that, I don't think they literally believe they have one culture. I think everyone's aspiring to that one culture, but they appreciate that it's really an amalgamation of cultures. Now the question is that, okay, you can kind of fall prey to, you say that culture so many times that you end up not providing the time, resources, or effort to explore what might that different cultures actually be. You can see companies. It would also work at a country level too, very much like the US. But in a company, exploring what those are through different means. I think one of the more common means you see many leading companies using are surveys. Obviously, there can be a discrepancy between paper and practice. You put things on paper. Here's what we are. Here's what we do. Here's what the manager does. Here's how we follow various practices. And it turns out that's on paper, and practice might differ. I believe the name of this, this is alluding to like the name of our session together, a paper versus practice. But one of the things that's so fascinating is you ask people, in their opinion, do you think your manager, acts with integrity? Like sometimes, always, rarely, never. And what you will generally find, almost within any large company, is you're going to get many areas that thinks their manager and leadership, they walk the talk, they're awesome. But then you're going to find these pockets in which people have wildly different views of their managers. And the question is, well, why? Why is that? Is it because their manager is actually doing something that is seemingly undermining that trust? Or is it because that there is a new manager that's coming and that culture is not jiving? Or is it just simply some urban kind of legend that seems to be arising? I'll give one other example that, so the Department of Justice routinely asks if a firm is under, like, for example, a DPA. One of the questions that's routinely asked is, are managers or are individuals of different rank in seniority, are they disciplined in the same way as others? So are senior and junior people somehow treated differentially? With the obviously implicit question here of, are senior people kind of let off the hook and junior people are the ones that ultimately get sacked when something bad happens? One can actually look at this pretty straightforward through like a regression. So you can evaluate, like, does the firm actually follow their policy? You basically are running a regression, thinking about the outcome, and then looking at seniority, the type of violation, controlling for tenure, background, gender, and all these other characteristics. You can actually pin that down very carefully, like, does the firm treat people differentially? So you can answer that unambiguously with a kind of a yes or no answer. What's fascinating is we've done enough work with companies where we actually run that regression, but then we look within the company and you're going to have subgroups that actually think that this is wildly off, where 70, 80% of the people think that senior leaders get away with it, so to speak. And then the question is, what's really interesting here is we know for a fact, actually, that these perceptions are not based in fact, or at least recent fact, because we know that actually people are being treated fairly. But employees have a perception that's not the case. And if employees have the perception that other people get off the hook, or certain people can get off the hook, obviously that's undermining organizational justice, that's undermining the integrity of the company. And so then it's trying to dig in, why is that the case? Is there an urban legend from 5 years ago when, that someone actually was let off the hook? Typically, that's actually not the case. What we found by looking into this is sometimes the firm, and for a lot of, I'll say, legal and privacy reasons, doesn't talk about disciplinary action. And so people are left guessing. And there is a sense sometimes of that, because the people who are close to them that face sanctions are generally much more salient because they see them, they hear the person talking about it, and the manager or people that are far away, they don't know everything around it, so people don't draw necessarily the right inferences. And so what we've seen is that some of the companies, to try to adjust this, have actually started publicizing, so it's actually sending emails or providing within compliance training or other types of training, more transparency around disciplinary action within the company. And so sometimes it's anonymizing cases, obviously to protect, again, privacy in other areas, but to say, hey, an X person of this rank did this, like, this is what happened to them. And so it's based on a real case. And so people know that there's action behind. And so it's trying to actually have people better understand that connection between these areas. So it's an area where we're trying to understand the subculture and then something to do with that information or data. I think so. Surveying is still an area that's it's emerging. It still kind of sits in the HR world because most people in HR are concerned about turnover and well-being. I think there's an equally, or in some ways, I'm saying biased when I say this, more important use actually in the integrity sphere within an organization, to understand if paper and practice are actually matching. And that only arises when employee perceptions are aligned with what's on paper.
That's a very interesting observation. Also, because you would think that now, of course, there's a lot of attention for CEOs who have to step down for integrity problems. But what I heard you saying was to also be very transparent about other levels within the organization and what is done there. I think it's a very interesting observation.
CEO is also very, and it's interesting because obviously we always think of tone from the top. It's like, it's something we say, we're professors, like in business school, we say this a lot, in law school, everyone says tone from the top. But I think if you actually look to most people in an organization, the CEO is someone that's like, this fancy person that's paid a lot, that gets to fly around a private jet. Like, they don't relate. If you're in like a large company, no one relates to the CEO. Who do you relate to? You relate to your manager. Maybe if you're lucky, your manager's manager. And what they say and do and behave is how you think the world operates. And I actually have come to say we should probably spend time thinking like tone from the middle is like the first order, and then tone from the top is second order. Obviously, if the tone from the top is awful, presumably tone from the middle will trickle down, also be awful. But for day-to-day, you look to your manager about how to behave. If your manager blows off compliance training and say this is a waste of time, like we need to get back to our work, so just click through the screens, everyone else will also think that. And it doesn't matter what the CEO and how many videos he or she does saying how important this is to the company. It's what your manager says and does that creates the surrounding culture.
Sure. Thanks. We have a question from Edgar Karsing, a professor at Nijrode, and he says, what can we do from an educational perspective to deal with our Stone Age minds and to the, and the Stone Age minds of others?
And I will say, and let me be very clear, mine as well here. We're all susceptible. So I'm going to play devil's advocate against my own, or I'll say our own profession here, but also a lot of compliance, I'll say corporate and compliance training as well. The challenge I think we all face within training settings, whether we're talking a business school, a law school, or corporate training, is that most of the exercises we do to try to cultivate greater integrity are pretty trivial. What do I mean by that? We identify the potential issue, at hand. So we have thousands of decisions that each of us make over the course of the day. In the scenario, we literally isolate that from the hundreds of other decisions that we face. Two, we generally, especially if we're doing this in person or we're doing this in a discussion like in a classroom, we're going to spend half an hour, maybe longer, discussing it. So we're spending time. Three, we're oftentimes doing that with a group of people that think a little bit differently from ourselves. We have heterogeneity in the classroom. In the real world, all of this is more complicated. No one isolates the decision. You have to make decisions very quickly. And generally, you're either doing it alone or with a group of people that think very similarly. That's really, really hard. And I oftentimes think, I wrote a case and we discussed it at Harvard Business School, a case on Rajat Gupta, the former managing director of McKinsey. And, his, the essence in short of the misconduct is that, after a Goldman Sachs board meeting, he called a billionaire hedge fund trader, allegedly, I would say divulged confidential information associated with the meeting, but this is like 25 seconds after the board meeting. We don't really need a case study. And in fact, I did write this as a case, but we don't really need a case study to teach people, like, should you, after a board meeting, call someone at a hedge fund and divulge any information or even the existence of that board meeting? I will say, literally, I really hope every one of our students and in our respective companies, every single person in a company knows that, like, that's a terrible idea. And it's like almost like a trivially easy decision to make. But then we should contrast that with the fact that if you're the managing director of McKinsey & Company, like you are a brilliant individual. You don't get to that position with anything short of being strategic and thoughtful for literally decades at a time to reach that position in business. And so how does someone that is seemingly for decades engage in such careful, thoughtful, reflective, strategic decision-making also simultaneously do something that seems so trivially myopic? In a sense, I'm going to say we should just sit there and say, we don't exactly know how that happens in the end, but what we should take is that some degree of humility from this, that someone like him is susceptible to such a, you could say, a kind of a silly, trivial oversight. And so maybe we're all susceptible to that in the typical ways that we're training people to actually be more aware. I'll say those kind of case and training sessions. It's actually it's cultivating confidence rather than cultivating humility, because what you do the insider trading scenario, you do the bribery scenario. Again, those are simulations. They're very easy. We sit there in the comfort of our classroom and we kind of check the box that, of course, we know what to do if the situation arises. But maybe we should spend more time reflecting, not on how we will respond, but reflecting on people like Rajat Gupta and knowing the fact that someone of his stature and someone in many ways I think we should respect for a lot of the things he's done in his career could fall prey to those imperfect Stone Age intuitions. and actually figure out how do we cultivate both humility in ourselves, and then think about what are the systems and control processes, and I think broader compliance processes that we can put into place to help us stop ourselves from falling down that slippery slope. So this is my call, I'll say in class when I discuss this is my call to, this is actually where compliance gets really interesting, because we think of compliance as a lot of those check the box systems, but also we can think of compliance thinking about our own personal systems and organizational systems that we put into place to help nudge us to think differently about different perspectives. Certainly, if I have challenging decisions, there are a set of people. I have one or two people that are good friends from college. I have my wife, who I bounce those sometimes challenging decisions by, that sometimes I know it's the catch-22. There are things that both sides have some ramifications. And I will say there are a group of people that I know will always provide a different view than I have. But that's my own kind of mini compliance and control system I've created. But I think what we try to do is spend more time in our training and our classroom exercise trying to think about how we cultivate similar systems for our students and others.
Thank you. And maybe in addition to that, when you were talking about Stone Age minds, you were also talking about rules that do not seem harmful to others. Whereas in the Gupta example, you make very clear that this is something, even with a Stone Age mind, this is not something that you would do, perhaps. But of course, there are other rules, or there are developments in law where things that were acceptable, let's say 20 years ago, are not acceptable now. Do you think that education would have a role to play there, where to kind of show the relevance of new rules or new norms that would not be considered as important, maybe would not be considered as important by our parents, perhaps, or our grandparents?
This is a cool question, because I will say, maybe I can think about a little bit about what I call the intent and spirit of rules and law, and how sometimes those get manifested in high performance organizations. So I'll take an example like bribery, because I see what happens in a lot of both my classroom, but also I see the organizations working on projects with, is that in many high performance organizations, people actually do have a good sense, and there are great compliance systems to try to prevent people from breaking the literal rule. But that doesn't mean we don't want to do it. I'm describing it like this. And so bribery is a very good example. I mean, most organizations have pretty good systems right now. Not all, as we see by the number of like FCPA and other bribery cases. And the Netherlands is actually, actually quite aggressive also on its anti-bribery commitment as a jurisdiction. People generally are not bringing like suitcases of money, overseas to like give to politicians. Still happens, but I will say not very common. But a lot of people know that in order to win contracts in certain parts of the world, you still need to do favors, what we would describe as a bribe. And so I think what I've kind of been slowly documenting over time is like, so what do companies do, and what do individuals do? And I will give just one example. I learned from working on a project, and this was in Southeast Asia. In order to win certain permits, in order to do the contracting work, you need to get actually stamps of certain ministers. And so the initial thing is we basically need to give this person some money, and there are certain countries in the world that was kind of acceptable. The problem is in other places of the world, like the US, or if you're a European-based company, that was considered like a no-go zone. But you still need to do something in order to get the permit. And so what did one organization come up with? What they decided to do, and this became like, I'll say their kind of clever workaround, so to speak, is they were gifting works of art that were worth like, $100, $200 to the minister. And, something you can put on your books and records, here's a $250 drawing by an up and coming artist from some place. And then you kind of know at the end of the meeting that this is an up and coming artist. And perhaps if this was sold at some obscure auction house, 6 months later, maybe it would be worth a lot more, maybe like $50,000. And then what does the company do? They buy it back at the auction house 6 months later for $50,000. So what have you done? I mean, it's actually quite clever. You've literally on your books and records, giving someone $100 work of art. Separately, actually, at an auction house, so it actually is separated. You buy that work for $50,000. So you've transferred, $49,000 to all on your correct books and records. And short of someone writing an email describing this scheme in detail, this would be exceptionally difficult for any regulator or enforcement agency anywhere in the world to either allege or prove that that was a bribe. And so I think the challenge is that we might have the sense of compliance. We don't pay bribes because that's what the law, but do we have the culture? And this goes, Jonathan, back to your question about the culture. Do we have the culture of not paying bribes? And I think what sometimes I observe is there are a lot of high performance companies that have the culture of we don't break laws, but we also don't have the culture of saying that we want to follow the spirit of those laws. In fact, some high performance cultures say we actually reward people that find those clever loopholes and workarounds. And I would say, they obviously the kind of this extreme and celebrate case, this was Enron kind of in a nutshell. Every time they found a law, they had some actually very clever, brilliant people try to find workarounds. Now, if you play that game enough, eventually you're going to err, you're going to forget to dot one I or cross one T, and then people will appropriately, and some regulator will then whack you for fraud. But you can actually go a long way and engage in a lot of conduct, which is what I call that kind of loopholes and workarounds. And this is not just in the tax space, which is kind of the tax is the obvious area where everything is taxed, is structured transactions. But I would say if we almost pick any kind of violation, we can have a kind of a fun and probably very worrisome discussion of 5 other ways we could try to achieve that exact same outcome, but do it in a way that is unlikely to break the law or of such low probability that would be detected that effectively it would be permissible in most jurisdictions. I don't know, maybe just made you worried there without example. So
yes, in a way we should become more Stone Age, so not to be too clever anymore.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, this is like high-powered incentives put on like our kind of Stone Age, which is I want to still do X. And what we start doing is use all our modern brain power to try to then figure out how to achieve that.
We have another question from Ruud. You mentioned predictive elements in data. Of course, this is a question. You knew it was coming. And you explained HR problems connected to misconduct. Are there more predictive elements to consider?
Yes. Okay. Well, we can go, and I could probably spend, a day talking about, every variable. So we've generally focused on looking at what I would describe as HR, production, compliance, survey data are different kinds of data. And what we're literally trying to do is, and this is running, basic, the technical way would be like machine learning model, generally they look like logistic type models, trying to predict where we expect to see future allegations or substantiated allegations of misconduct. And I would say why I say allegations and also substantiated is obviously there are a lot of barriers to substantiating allegations. So sometimes it's useful to think of simply, can we predict where allegations are likely to arise? Variables that, some other variables of potential. So I mentioned unsubstantiated HR issues. On the survey side, one of the more powerful variables is actually psychological safety. Something that I suspect many people here have heard and talked about. It's the ability to actually speak up when there are issues within an organization. So when you generally see groups that have low psychological safety, you're going to find those groups are much more prone to actually have the bigger issues arise. I think it's pretty intuitive in many ways. If people can't talk about the small stuff and the little things they see day to day to people on their team, those things generally don't get addressed by centralized systems. They generally bubble up, get bigger and bigger, like the volcano that grows until it actually bubbles up into something that now global or centralized legal and compliance is actually dealing with. So understanding which groups have low psychological safety and then understanding the root causes. And sometimes they're, I'll say, great and well-intentioned managers that just are under a lot of pressure to deliver and so are not tolerating dissent or opinions from other people. And maybe that works for a couple days or in the short run, but in the long run, that can actually breed a lot of concerns around potential what I call emerging compliance threats. One variable that does not predict future compliance violations which is anonymous reporting rates. I think almost every CCO at every firm, for a lot of good reasons, and anonymous reporting rates are valuable to think about and look at for a variety of, I think, psychological and cultural reasons. But it's an indicator about where your investigations are going to be busier in the future. We've not found across any organization the anonymous reporting rate to have any future predictive power. And then maybe the last one I'll mention here is in terms of thinking about where violations. So a lot of times I think we look at, let's say, reporting rates per 1,000 as being the leading indicator. So if I see a higher substantiated rate violations in Boston versus Chicago per 1,000, I know Boston will be the area that is more risky in the future. There is a weak signaling to that. So where there are past issues, there will likely be future issues. But actually, that's not the most first order effect. What we've actually found is if you look at the manager violation, effectively per 1,000 rate, the manager effect wildly dominates the individual effect. And I think this is also fairly intuitive in the fact that if you have a manager that engages in certain misconduct, and for a lot of reasons is still at the firm, so gets a warning or some kind of bonus reduction, employees don't see necessarily the sanction, or don't always fully appreciate the sanction. What they oftentimes do know about, or at least hear about through the grapevine, is that manager did X, manager still here managing. As a result, that conduct is in some way viewed as permissible. And so what do we see down the road? We see more of those violations populating. In fact, what we see is if a manager engages in a violation, the propensity that we will see an individual that works for him or her engage in that same behavior in the coming quarter goes up, holding all else equal, by around 300%. So this goes to, Jonathan, our conversation about tone from the middle. It really is. If the manager does the X, people learn from that manager, and sometimes that can be in good ways, and sometimes that can be in unproductive ways.
So I'm sure that people are waiting for more predictive elements here, because this
those are the strongest ones across.
I think they're all sitting.
Everyone.
I think they're all typing now. Now you are a bit, and I'm happy that you're here live now, because when I was reading your book, there is a pessimistic element to your book. We think we can do it right, but at the difficulty of doing good, etc. Now, you've already explained some of the reasons for your pessimism, but I basically want to give you the option. If you could choose, would you take us into a more pessimistic direction or into a more positive, optimistic direction?
So it's interesting you say that, actually, because I mean, maybe this is just my personality. I still think I'm pretty optimistic about most of the business world, despite the fact that I spend my entire day effectively reviewing hotlines and looking at misconduct. But I realize maybe that is my trying to create my happy shades on a otherwise fairly dark world that I look at. I guess I see it as really tension. I guess maybe not optimistic or pessimistic. It's more of a healthy tension that we need to maintain. And maybe this is my sense of, it's so easy to fall prey to what I call ivory tower mentality. And that's not just being an academic, but I think that's working in a lot of prestigious companies and elite companies. It's a sense of, we know what's good for everyone. We know how to always behave correctly, and bad things don't happen to people like us. And I actually think this is the hardest part that regulators face and enforcement agencies face, is even when people are engaged in really outrageous conduct, really outrageous. And I've had people I'm talking to before, I'll say everything explodes and they're going to be going to prison, and they genuinely don't see it as that big of a deal. I would say it's the equivalent of going 65 and the 55, that you can talk to them, they're like, yeah, okay, we overstated this, we could have been more transparent around X. But it's not so dissimilar that a couple of times I've been pulled over, and and it's like, do you know what you did? And you're like, okay, I was going 70 in the 55, and part of me is like, of course I know I was supposed to be going 55 in the 55, but do I really need the ticket today? It's kind of like that. And that's, I think, what we kind of imagine. If we go 70 and 55, we get pulled over, we're all like, yeah, but, and I think the hard part is there are certain things that we can do that are not 70 and the 55. And those happen in the corporate context because the amount of impact that we can have, I'll say as an academic, the amount of harm that we can create is still pretty, I will say, minimal. The amount of people that are just impacted by a day-to-day decision. But you're in a major company making decisions that have, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of investors. With consumers, a product that you potentially know ought to be recalled, but you see the ramifications. It's probably not that serious. It's such an extreme situation, something bad could happen, that you don't think about that it's so abstract that you can let it go. And so you think it's 70 in the 55, but really it's like 125 in the 55. And so I don't know if that's pessimism, or I think that optimism is that it's a healthy tension. It's one that I try to confront and even think about myself frequently in my own little bubble. But it's one that I think is really challenging in large organizations, especially as it becomes more dispersed. It becomes one that it's very easy to fall prey to. We're smart, good people that have our high integrity. And so the one time we do something that's a little bit sketchy or a little bit more aggressive, we still fall back on the notion of we're a high integrity person, a high integrity company. And that's maybe the risk. And maybe that's where I'm pessimistic, is that I think oftentimes, unfortunately, we fall prey to that decision making.
I'm also looking at the participants to see if they have any other questions. I'm sure they do, but the question is whether they want to ask them.
Well, I'm trying to make it. I'm optimistic, so we can go in more of an optimistic direction.
Well, maybe to follow this new optimistic course, you also seem to suggest that people can become over-cultured within the organization. So the organization has a kind of culture or subculture or middle culture, or whatever, and they get so entangled within this culture that they actually lose sight of the bigger picture or the actual societal outcomes. Do you think that let's say an excellent compliance system, for example, can cause over-culturing, that people feel to kind of lose their normal minds? Their normal minds.
I like how you're phrasing this. I think so. Let me maybe I'm going to reframe, but maybe hopefully getting to your question is that it's very easy, in the world where many of us are increasingly focused on things like ESG and CSR, and we have these really big aspirational goals that companies say we want to have a stakeholder view. And I think what I would describe as a high integrity organization is one that actually, sorry,
bless you.
Thank you. One that understands that there are always trade-offs being made. So where I become, and I'm going to give my personal kind of reflection of maybe integrity now, is that we care so much about, we care about employees, society more at large. And I appreciate great organizations. I hope everyone does think about all of these. But simultaneously, we're also every day making trade-offs between those different groups, between investors and employees and outside stakeholders. And I think what a lot of organizations do is you almost drink so much of the Kool-Aid by saying stakeholders, ESG, that you actually lose sight that every decision is a trade-off between these, and actually should have some tension. And that there are certain things that you're doing, which actually you might be doing something that quite deliberately actually places employees above investors. And maybe that's great. But there are times you're probably going to place your employees, investors above society and vice versa. And that's switching. And most companies that I think are healthy companies actually are making those trade-offs all the time in a way that ultimately leads to an equilibrium that feels balanced and is aligned with that company's mission and values and purpose. I think it's really hard on the outside for anyone to tell, as a consumer, as an investor, to actually figure out how is the company making those trade-offs? Because so often leadership and I would say reports are being that kind of every company looks like, especially more what I call forward-looking or progressive companies, kind of put everyone on some level playing field, and it blurs the distinction between how those decisions are being made. And I think high integrity and transparent organizations are ones that internally actually have a good understanding of that. Sometimes that's itself very hard. Employees actually understand how those trade-offs are made, and then companies that are able to effectively communicate that to outside parties. You know, I see in the US, for example, a lot of financial institutions, many of which have signed up for various pledges saying how they were going to have a stakeholder model. Certain things in like the energy markets have become very political. And now many of them are now running kind of back the other direction, writing letters about how much financing they give to oil and gas companies because they were effectively being, and I'm looking at this with the degree of, I don't think actually anything has changed within the company between when they signed a pledge, when they're now writing new letters, when they're now changing their marketing around. Nothing has changed internally from the positioning or strategy of the company, but they're just kind of jumping around to try to, I'll say different things to different groups. And it's leading to, I think, a lot of like, it's why people outside of business are very cynical of business. And I think if we could be much more transparent, I think that would help address a lot of this, what I call the concern people have with the business community at large, and the functions it can play for doing well and actually contributing to a lot of these important social purposes, but also integrity more broadly as a community and a society. I realize it might be a circuitous way of answering your question, but I think it's one of the things that we're really grappling with. I think especially as we take on, as business seeks to take on and grapple with these bigger and bigger questions. Yeah. Maybe you view this differently, and
I like the words.
I gave my that's a personal reflection looking.
Equilibrium. I mean, it's getting more positive. We're getting more positive.
Yeah, equal positive. So because we want, I mean, I really hope business can actually be a force to actually tackle a lot of these questions. And I think why people are so cynical about businesses' capacity to do that is not because businesses are not investing or don't care about these things, but it's because they know that one day they will look like they're about to, like, you know, solve the world, and all the world's ills will be solved by the bank. And then 3 months later, they're like celebrating how much capital they're giving to, you know, XYZ organization. And people are rightfully, and employees are cynical about that because it doesn't seem coherent or consistent.
Yeah. We have another question that brings us to the negative again.
We tried. Okay, well, there we go.
From a fraud triangle point of view, you address the rationalization and obviously the opportunity. But what do you see, this from Nicolette Jager, what do you see was the urge for the situations you came across? Was there ever a conscious driver?
Yeah, a conscious driver. So I don't know if we could ever, and I don't think in any of the work we can actually say, we can, and I will say most of the cases in the book, you'll see I'm studying the absence of what people were not thinking about rather than what people were thinking about, because I don't know if we can ever reconstruct what people were not thinking about at the time it was actually going on. And I think the one consistent thing that we can see is people are not thinking about the consequences of their actions. I think so, and that's on the kind of on the what's missing consequences. On the positive side, I think there's a whole host of drivers that people could think, but what makes white collar so interesting, people are, you don't engage in white collar crimes to harm people. You engage in white collar crimes for some ulterior motive, which is to help your company, help people maybe keep their jobs, keep your prestige. You might be doing it to keep like the money that you want to have. But those are actually like externalities to the actual crime itself that could be going through someone's mind. And I think that's what's so, I will say the part that I find interesting and challenging are there all these ulterior motives, but the thing that people really do need to think about is the consequences to deter them. Because we would, of course, all love all these lovely upsides. What we would all be fearful of is the potential downsides. And so at least where a lot of the work trying to focus on is how to make those downsides or those consequences much more present when people are actually making some of these decisions. Also, the one area we're trying to explore is now, so we're running a number of company and organizational, for example, for the US government, we run the helpline. So if you're going to report like an allegation of fraud. And one of the questions that, you know, my organization, so this is Integrity Lab, where we've asked to provide this data to organizations, is asking people why they're speaking up now. Because I think one of the things we don't understand very well is when people decide to actually even speak up, what motivates someone when there are costs and consequences associated with speaking up? Why are they bringing this up now? Because most people don't immediately see a bad thing or see something they're uncomfortable with, or even participate in something that they're uncomfortable with, and then immediately 3 minutes later run and kind of press the eject button. Like, there's always a time what I call interlude. Sometimes that's hours, sometimes that's days, sometimes it's weeks, sometimes, and often it's months or even years can go by. And what we're trying to understand is what is the reason why there is that delay, one, and two, what encourages someone after that delay to all of a sudden say something needs to be done differently? It's too early. Maybe I'm going to set up so I can, contribute and come out to Amsterdam on a future occasion once we solve that question. But I will say we're getting some kind of intriguing data and trying to collect that data to understand like what motivates people right now to behave differently. And so this trying to go back on the optimistic side. Why now is it am I willing to engage in that cost and speak up, which is kind of the inverted side of what did I do the bad thing now versus the good thing.
Sure. And Edgar Carson is asking now, how could we help people make the consequences more present?
Yeah, I will say this is the part that I will say most of the exercises that people have tried in like I'll say behavioral kind of economics, like these nudges. I will say one of the kind of great excitements we've had over the last 20 years is all the nudges. A lot of those nudges have been found not to what I call, some instances, replicate, or even worse, what some of the nudges is they don't last. What I call they last, the first time or the second time, but they don't last years. It's like deciding at different parts of the form, kind of what I call, maybe it works the first time, but after you've done it 1,000 times, it doesn't matter what font you put it in or what lettering, it doesn't work. And I think that's one of the challenges that we really face with, I'll say, trying to use nudges. Ultimately, again, I'm going to interject with some of the kind of current work we're exploring, so I can't substantiate this with data, so I'm going to give my impression. To the extent it's part of culture, I would say it's a cultural norm. To the extent it's a cultural norm to not do X, again, it becomes less present within our just choice set. There are a lot of things that, I have young kids at home. There are a lot of things they never think of doing. I mean, they're very smart. They never you don't go towards the knives. They don't play with like the stove. There's nothing natural. In fact, those things might look quite interesting if you were just going to come in and say like they're shiny and they're very interesting. But what did my wife and I do? We've spent endless times like you get near that. Like they know that there's a culture within our house. There are certain things you don't go near. There's certain things that you don't do. And I'm pretty confident my kids don't, every time they get near like the knives, say, should I or should I not do that? It doesn't, at this point, it just is part of our household culture because we've made this such a routine that's not something they consider, but it's quite artificial. We've created those rules and we probably have a whole host of very other arbitrary rules in our house. Like when dad is on a conference call, you don't come into the room. My kids are great at that, but it's because it's been socialized so significantly over and over again. And I think we're all a little bit like kids in this regard because these are artificial norms in our Stone Age mind. And so a little like what we have to do with our, kids, we need to do with ourselves, and things that are actually really important for maintaining the integrity of an organization. We need to say again and again and again. We need to do that in lots of different ways, and such that it becomes second nature that we don't even think of doing something like that. And it's not that we don't find, going back to our earlier, it's not that we shouldn't just do that from a rule standpoint, but we don't find a clever way to circumvent that rule to achieve that because it's just not what we do here in our house or not what we do here in our organization.
As a virtue ethicist, I could not agree more.
There we go. And we can end on something I suspect you would agree with.
Thank you. I'm looking at the participants to see if they have any more questions. Because you're completely right. This is something. I mean, of course, in this artificial setting where where you're only facing me and behind me there are all these other participants. I mean, it's completely artificial, and of course, we would love to have you in the room someday. Also, looking at the people who are participating in this call, because this is triggering way too much. To put into simple back and forth questions, and I'm sure everybody has a bag of experience that they would love having you look into. I had some closing remarks, but now you ended on this virtual ethical stance. So I think everything is perfect now. Eugene, thank you so much. This was a widely interesting session, and for those that didn't know you before, they will never forget you anymore. I hope, I'm sure. I think it will also set people on the right course to read your book. We really hope to see you live someday. If you're in the Netherlands, just let us know. We would love to receive you. And thank you so much for taking your time early morning to speak to a group of Dutch compliance and integrity geeks.
Really my privilege. Thank you so much, and I'll absolutely take you up on that. I look forward to coming over. That would be my privilege.
Thank you so much, and I also see the thank yous coming in here. So thank you.
Thank you.